I would like now to introduce today's presenter. Jimit Arora, partner, leads Everest Group's practice focused on serving enterprise customers. This responsibility spans Everest Group's research offerings focused on executives in IT, sourcing and vendor management, and shared services. Rohitashwa Agarwal, Vice President, is a global leader for Everest Global Sourcing Practice and has rich experience across projects covering global business services, growth and evolution strategy, location selection and portfolio optimization, cost optimization, impact sourcing, and GBS value proposition. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Rohitashwa.
Thank you, Raphael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants today. We are happy to have you join us. Today's webinar is very important, is on a very important topic. It's been more than a year now since we have seen a very difficult talent market situation. Organizations across the globe, across industries have been struggling to find the right talent. There is no doubt that human capital is right now the biggest investment gap that global enterprises are struggling with. However, in IT industry, this challenge is much more critical. It is much more complicated, and there is no relief in sight. According to our latest research, organizations are taking 2 to 3 times what they were taking to hire candidates in the pre-pandemic world. There are job roles that are staying open for easily about 6 to 9 months, sometimes even 12 months. There is increase in early tenure attrition, which further complicates life. We did a research about 2 months back, and about more than 75% or roughly 3 in every 4 tech workers are looking to change jobs. There are different reasons why they're doing this, a combination of compensation, work culture, nature of work, projects, and other things. We'll talk more about that today, but the situation is pretty tense. And lastly, as organizations have started returning to work, they are realizing that they are underprepared to work in a hybrid environment. Back in 2020, when everybody and everything moved remote, it was surprising how quickly the industry adapted, individuals adapted. However, as we are starting to see some of the workforce return to work, providing homogeneous experience, maintaining an organization's culture in a hybrid environment is becoming increasingly difficult. And that's something that organizations are worried about. In today's webinar, we are going to cover 2 different things. We are going to share some of our latest analysis. It is a very different, very fresh perspective of looking at what really impacts employees' decision to join a particular organization. And we'll be sharing our analysis on the top employers for tech talent. We have done this for many industries and many regions. We'll share some of that today with you. Following that, we will uncover the key factors that we believe are important in attracting the high potential techies. So we'll talk about that, and we'll take questions from the audience towards the end. So feel free to keep posting your questions in the chat window throughout this discussion. Let's start with let's start by getting some inputs from all of you. So this is going to be a poll question. You'll see the poll window pop up on your screens now. And we would love to know which one do you believe is the most overlooked dimension when you're talking about attracting tech employees?
And Rohit, I'm jumping in here. I can see a bit of the poll results come through. I know we're going to leave this open for a bit. It's surprising. There's quite a few that are tracking similarly, right? We'll obviously show the answers in terms of what we've seen from real world employees, but right now, it's career development, progression, culture, and values that are almost going neck to neck, right? With comp and ben being a third, flexibility. It's almost an even race at this stage. Let's maybe leave this for another 10 seconds. And we can call it maybe a close. So, Rohit, are you surprised as you see this? Career development, progression, culture, flexibility, followed by comp and ben.
Slightly surprised, Jimit, not by the fact that those four are at the top, but surprised that the margin between the top ones and something like diversity and inclusion is so high. That's something which I find is a little bit odd that this group is sharing versus what I've seen elsewhere. What are your thoughts?
And I'm actually, I think it's underscoring at least the fact that the first four are equally important to the workforce, right? I will say that and I know later in the document, you're going to be sharing some of the correlations as to what really drives high performance ratings. And I think we'll see some separation come through. But I was expecting to see at least one or two dimensions being higher than the others. So it's interesting, right? The at least for this audience, development and progression seems to be number one, not by too much, followed by culture and flexibility, right? What is interesting is, and that's something that's proven out time and time again, that comp and ben, while important, is not the fundamental driver for what really makes a place attractive versus not. So glad to see that that thesis bears out. The separation, obviously, as you mentioned, between diversity, inclusion, and the others is interesting versus other cohorts who we've.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Great start. So, I just wanted to take a minute to potentially just call out, okay, give a bit of a background as to why we've conducted this. I know we've done a LinkedIn Live a couple of weeks ago on a similar topic where we were unveiling a portion of what we are presenting today. But let's face it, tech workforce expectations are transforming. And if you think about it, we are at this unique opportunity where we've got four different demographic cohorts in the workforce, right? So you got boomers, you got Gen X, millennials are a big part, and then Gen Z is also making up a lot of the new additions into the tech employee workforce. So what you are dealing with is a variety of expectations across the stack, right? On top of that, you layer in the fact that we had the great experiment which was forced because of COVID, which and last year or so we've been looking at the great resignation. Some people are calling it the great reevaluation, right? Trying to think through whether folks are reevaluating their choices. And then now there's some dark clouds looming about, hey, how does recession impact some of this, right? So as you think about a variety of these factors, we had a number of our clients, come to us and say, hey, we need to understand how we really are perceived. And is there a good way for us to get to a perception analysis, which is not just looking at us, which, you can do your own pulse surveys and get something, but how do we compare versus our peers? How do we compare versus the market, right? And yes, there's been a lot of sources which rate companies at an aggregate level, but most employer perception studies were not focusing on tech. So in some ways, this was a problem statement that emerged from our clients wanting to get real world evidence of how they were perceived and how those perceptions were trending, right? And that's how we kind of came up with this methodology to create this outside-in proxy for how current and prospective candidates are perceiving their employers, right? And it did give us some very interesting results. We piloted it out in a few industries, and we'll show those rankings in a moment. But it's been a fun journey over the last 3 to 4 months as we've been looking at this across a variety of ways.
And as they say, Jimit, the great resignation paved the way for the great innovation. and that innovation has to happen at all levels. And one of the things is how do employers really open themselves up for all sorts of evaluation and relook where they stand. So before we get to the actual findings of this assessment, let me spend some time in sharing how we got there. What exactly is the approach we followed? What is the analysis we did? The assessment that you will see today, as Jimit described, this is based on the perception of employers for tech talent in various industries and geographies. To do this assessment, we have looked at 5 key dimensions. We have looked at the employee satisfaction grades. How happy are they with their employers? Would they recommend these employers to others, their friends, others in their network? Second, compensation and benefit, work environment being the third. Both of them were pretty important in the poll that we conducted earlier today. So how they satisfied with the overall, not just compensation, not just the salary, but the benefit structure and overall, what do they get in return of their services. Uh, Work environment includes a variety of factors: flexibility, autonomy, quality of leadership, culture, the kind of work you do. And then we're looking at career opportunities. How quickly can individuals grow? Is it really meritocracy based? Do they get diverse exposure? Do they get exposure to learn new skills? All of these factors. And lastly, though the poll today indicated that this is less important, we are increasingly seeing diversity and inclusion become more and more important. There are many examples where the next generation of workforce, the next employee group, is making career decisions based on the D&I activities of their employers. So they are really committed to the cause. And as we looked at all these dimensions, we went through gigabytes and gigabytes of data. We looked at all popular public sources of information. Some of the most prominent ones include Glassdoor, Indeed, LinkedIn, our own research. We're always listening. We're always talking to employers and in the market. And we looked at all of that. I'm not reading out each dimension. Some of it is there in front of you. But we looked at each of these sources to pick up the feedback that employees provide, the comments they make, the recommendations they are making to identify ratings and, like I said, feedback for all the dimensions that were mentioned on the previous page. And all of this was brought together in what I would like to say a reasonably sophisticated assessment model, which normalizes the information, takes away some of the data, usual data errors, to allow us to do the relative assessment of these companies. Jimit, let's not keep people waiting anymore.
Yeah.
What were the findings?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting, and just to kind of back up for a second and share what we are unveiling today is the results for the 3 industries that we picked up, right? So financial services, insurance, and high tech, right? Again, I want to reinforce, Rohit, something you mentioned. This is an outside-in proxy study. It's based on perceptions. So what you're seeing here is not any kind of formal benchmarking. The companies have not paid us to do this. The companies have not had a chance to kind of alter the results in any way. In a lot of ways, we see this as a purist lens. We applied methodologies and information sources that a prospective employer would look at in their own diligence and research, right? And we focus this just on tech, just on the US. So if you look at the US for financial services, it's pretty interesting. And we did 30 of them in BFS, banking financial services, and then 20 each in high tech and insurance. If you look at the top 5 here, right? I'd say that the left-hand side of the page, and this was the part that was really interesting for us, the left-hand side of the page doesn't have as many of the consumer brands, the big retail banks, not as many as you see on the right side. So you start to see, some of the more common retail financial services more towards the right. And in some ways, this kind of reflects the investments that are being made more by the asset managers, the capital markets companies in creating modern stacks, right? We are privileged to have Carl from AllianceBernstein join us for a session a couple of weeks ago. AllianceBernstein was the only company on this list to have an A+ employee satisfaction rating. Just to be transparent, this was more around, I think, anytime someone had more than 93% of, hey, how likely were you to refer a friend? 93% of folks in technology would be very comfortable or more referring a friend. That's an A+ rating. And then you can see across the stack, Comp and Ben, AllianceBernstein is probably not the highest there, right? But if you look at the work environment, career opportunities, and diversity inclusion, you can see that the ratings for those were really high. So ESAT combined with work environments is where we saw the highest correlation. And then if you look at, just a few more names in the list. So if you look at the top 5 in banking, AllianceBernstein we spoke about, Capital Group, Fidelity, again, more investment management, asset management versus retail financial services. Not a big surprise given the investments they're making there. And then the other 2 you see in the top 5 are what I consider as challenger banks, right? Capital One's made a name for themselves for being fundamentally embedded. Part of their value proposition is that you're not working in a financial institution, you're working in a tech company. One of the components that we looked at is where were people going from these companies? And a very interesting thesis was in this top 5 or in these 15 companies that you see towards the left, there were a lot of departures to big tech, right? People going to Amazon, people going to Netflix, Microsoft, Google, etc., which we think is a good, again, if you're losing folks to big tech, in some ways, it's actually a good news for your brand. Yes, nobody wants to lose people, but we did see a very high correlation for companies on the left-hand side of the page, in terms of where they were losing talent to. And Cap One is another one that kind of rises to the top for really taking a modern stack approach, which we'll see later on as well. So I know there's a lot to unpack here, and Rohit, I know later in the document, you'll also be sharing what our offer is for someone if they wanted a comparative done. One last point, as people are seeing some of these scores, especially the letter grades. We are geeky analysts. As we looked at this, we wanted to create forced separation. So the one thing I do want to call out is while these are 30 of the largest financial institutions, the relative grades are adjusted, right? Because we wanted to create the separation amongst 30 of these largest companies, right? If we had done this across, say, 500 financial institutions, I would expect most of these to cluster closely. But given that, most of our clients were interested in this cohort, this peer group, we thought it was important for that exaggerated grade separation.
Javed, thanks for that. But before we move on, did you say we did not charge these companies anything for this?
Clients get this as part of their membership, but no, this is not. I clarified this. I'm going to get into trouble with marketing for this, but the whole research industry has this perception of pay for play, right? It's one of those things you're not supposed to talk about, but why not? No, we did not charge anyone for this. We have no aspiration of charging people money, and there's no expectations here, or that's not part of our methodology. So no, you're right. We did not. This is service that we are providing for the industry, being students of studying talent topics.
And okay, so I assume there is no motivation to arrive at a certain result. What were the reactions? And again, I know you spoke to your friend, from Alliance, but forget about the number one. What were reactions from companies when you broke it to them? And how, if maybe some of our listeners are from these companies, how should they interpret that? What should be their mechanism to internalize it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Rohit. And in a lot of ways, we are seeing this not as a one-time effort, right? Our desire is to see this as a report which gives you a pathway to what are the initiatives you need to work on to stay contemporary, to stay current with the marketplace. I'd say for most people who were high on the list, it was a good validation of the investments they were making. What was more interesting was reactions from the folks who were lower down the list, right? At first, there was a bit of prove to me why this is accurate. But once you went through, showed them the data, showed them the methodology, read through the actual comments that were coming through, there was a lot more acceptance, and the conversation quickly pivots to, yes, this is in some ways blood works, right? You're seeing your report, you're seeing things which are aligned, which are misaligned, but fundamentally it's about the program that you embark on to fix these metrics for the future. So the conversations became, okay, if we are lagging on work environment, what are the things we need to do to fix work environment, right? Some of this has translated to companies figuring out how they need to change the pyramids and role designations to really align with market standards and client expectations. And again, let's be clear, we have not had this situation where you've got 4 unique demographic cohorts in the workforce at the same time. So designing something which would appeal to the boomers as well as Gen Z is a challenge. And I think that's where some of the conversations are also going.
And just to highlight, you said this is not a one-time exercise. So as companies continue to work on their brand value proposition and perception, we'll also be evaluating this periodically to see how's this moving. Jimmy, do you want to share anything more on the other?
Yeah, so just again, if you look at technology, no surprises here as you think through some of the names, but there's a lot of obsession in terms of Meta, Facebook, Amazon, the whole FANG group in a lot of ways, and how they are most important. If you look at the top 3 here, though, they're probably well-known names, but not necessarily names that you associate with massive big tech, right? So NVIDIA, Intuit, ServiceNow, and then of course Netflix, right? The reason I pick on these 4 is because they got A+ ratings across the stack, right? And again, tech creates the right employee satisfaction. And then you have a couple more in terms of Salesforce and Google who also had the A ratings. What's really interesting about this group is that they've done really well across different dimensions. So not only is there high employee satisfaction, but you'll also see a few perfect scores in terms of comp and ben, work environment, right, career opportunities, and D&I, right? And I think that's where what's interesting about this group of companies is that as you would expect, right, tech talents want to work in high-tech companies. There's a lot more for folks to be able to learn from this cohort than elsewhere. And I think that's part of the reason why we also wanted to do it by industry, because in some ways, everyone knows, yes, you have to be like big tech, right? But then now what we also wanted to create was this inspiration. If you are a bank, how do you be like someone who's a higher ranked bank, right? From an EVP perspective, because it has been easy in the past for executives to say, oh yeah, we don't have the same amount of money that, let's say, a Google or a Salesforce or a ServiceNow might have. You're not based in Silicon Valley. So it's okay for us not to be compared with them. But our assessment does highlight, that tech companies definitely have their act together when it comes to creating the right opportunities and the right employee satisfaction for their workforce.
And one last question before we move on, Jimmy. So good to see companies being compared within a particular industry. But if somebody was to stack these against each other, directionally, are the ratings normalized? So if somebody picks up a certain ratings for tech companies versus finance companies, will they get directionally correct answers, or should they not compare?
No, I think directionally accurate. So the A pluses across the ESAT would be fairly comparable across different industry clusters.
And as we move on, let's look at what are some of the leaders or organizations that are top ranking doing differently. So if I move on to the next slide, let's look at the next one. So as we'll see, uh, this is not about doing one thing or the other. This is about getting a lot of things right. And as you'll see from the table on the top right, across all dimensions, when we look at the average score of the top 25 companies and the remaining 180, there is a clear difference where the top companies are having a higher score and by a margin across all these dimensions. What is really interesting, as Jimit was mentioning earlier, is we hear a lot of noise around compensation and work life balance. But what we have seen, as you'll see, the top three factors that impact the final uh, brand perception or the ability to attract and retain talent, where there is a strong set of values, a strong culture, where the senior management is inspiring and there are career opportunities, the workforce is not shying away from some adjustments on work-life balance. I'm not encouraging a poor work-life balance, but that it does not impact decision to go away. It does not impact decision to not join a firm. Even compensation, talent is willing to be part of an organization where they are able to work in a good environment and have the right career opportunities. So that clearly emerged as more important dimension.
Yeah. And Rohit, I think this is to me, this is one of the more fascinating pages, right? Where you say culture and values as having the highest correlation. The one thing I did want to point out is, explaining the N. So while we showcase the results for 3 industries, in the background, we've been looking at a broader pool. And right now, it's slightly over 200 companies that we've analyzed representing 10 industries. So the results on this page are not just restricted to those industries, but they're kind of focused on a broader group, cross industry. So even if you weren't in banking, high tech, insurance, we still believe that these findings are pertinent.
All right, so I think this is time to offer something more than our insights or our insights we already have to our listeners. So as Jimit mentioned earlier today, we have done it for, or he just said, we have done this for over 200 companies. We are happy to do this for you without any charge. All you need to do is click on the link in the chat. It will take you to a form where you can identify, where you can share location where you want to compare yourself with your peers. And you can also give us a list of up to 4 peers you want to compare yourself against. This option is for all the enterprise stakeholders who are attending today. And we'll look at your benchmark rating for the tech talent. How do you compare? And we'll get back to you with your customized ranking order. So the link will stay in the chat. You can look at it later and fill up the form. Let's move on and talk about, we already made some comments on this, but let's spend more time, Jimit. All this analysis is great, but how do companies, what are the key takeaways in terms of what can our listeners do to improve their brand perception?
Yeah, no, I think that the way we wanted to conduct this research was there's a bunch of quantitative dimensions which drove the correlations. What we also wanted to do was capture a bit of the voice of the employee. And as we looked through a lot of the reviews and what people were sharing in terms of what worked for them, right? Elements of culture, community stand out really strongly, right? So a strong graduate program came up, right? How do you really create a strong entry-level training came up as another potential reason to make sure that people were happy with their employees, right? And sorry, with their employers. So you'd see components that we've seen across the stack, but progression and learning is very important, as we are seeing here, which is where graduate program, the entry-level training, fast progression and lower experience levels, knowledgeable and helpful co-workers, right? Opportunities for internal mobility are coming in. So the big theme you're seeing here is this desire for progression and learning, right? And of course, you would also see things around compensation, benefits. But if you'll just see, the two themes below the strong graduate program, and I do want to call this out, and this is what I feel sets apart some of the more higher ranked firms versus others, is a very visible focus on diversity and the opportunities to create and contribute to society. So it's not just about profits, it's also about purpose. So yes, even in our own survey, it showed that the diversity inclusion wasn't as big of a deal, but we are seeing these as important dimensions in some of the most progressive firms that are out there. And on the flip side, right, again, the current tech workforce, what they really don't like is unclear growth aspirations, any shape and form of bureaucracy and politics, right? Old tech stack. If you had to do, ancient mainframe programming, I think you're not really going to be an employer of choice, which, in industries like banking and insurance is still a very viable thing, right? And then a desire to not really change things. So people recognize, and this has been the one thing about compensation that I think it's never possible to get it entirely accurate. But what I think people are looking for is how responsive are these companies once they know something's been highlighted as a challenge. And I do think another thing that set people apart is, yes, and this is where the dynamic nature becomes important. Yes, some things are missed right now. How quickly can you really fundamentally change over time? And so, bureaucracy, slow to move are some of the themes that really define attributes that people don't like in their employers.
And Jimit, what we also did was we synthesized all of this. We said, if we were to give sort of 5 action items, 5 considerations to our listeners today, what are these things? What are these 5 things they should do? And here's the list in front of you. We'll go through each of them one by one and dive a bit deeper into these. But to talk about these 5, first, think total rewards. It's not just one part of the overall reward structure, either a compensation or benefits. We have seen feedback both ways. Companies that have high compensation but poor benefit structure, they have got negative feedback. Companies that have great benefit structure, industry best, but are poor on the takeaway compensation, that's also receiving a lot of feedback, especially in the last few months. So think total rewards. Second, embrace flexibility. Flexibility is required in almost all aspects of your strategy today. While there is a direction, there is a plan. If you're not agile, you're not adapting, definitely it creates a problem. Third, as Jimit said, both on the slide with the green text and the red text, uh, learning opportunity, working on old tech stack, all of that jumped out. The workforce today is looking for an environment where they can learn continuously. We have seen top employers enable their workforce to do more and do better, even if it means that they are actually creating exit opportunities for them. You need to invest in your talent. Fourth, your employee value proposition needs to amplify the culture, purpose, and softer aspects, especially as we think about creating a hybrid workforce going forward. And lastly, DEI strategy needs to be pervasive. The benefits are proven, the benefits are there. It cannot be an optional thing, it has to be part of your mandatory strategy. So you need to do that. On the next slide, what we've also broken down, we have shared our framework for employee value proposition. This again is something which is continuously evolving. So we look at it, every few years. As you will see, against the 6 key dimensions or vertical pillars, we have broken down the levers into traditional and modern levers. What is important to recognize is that while you may have had a great employee value proposition at some point, it does not mean that your employee value proposition is appropriate as of today. So you need to continuously revisit it. Jimmy talked about creating a EVP for 4 different generations of workforce. So it's not easy. It needs to be a full package, and we will unravel more of it on the next few slides.
And again, I think comp and ben, we recognize it's important. I'm not gonna read through everything that's on this page. I'll fundamentally say that if you look at the themes on the left, if that's where you are, welcome to 2020, right? If your organization relates to the middle column in terms of the health and welfare benefits, learning and development, work from home benefits, you're welcome. You're just doing the bare minimum that the tech employees expect, right? And if you truly want to think about how you start creating differentiated experiences, I think that's where it becomes important to start to think about and defining policies around the issues on the right. One of the things, and I'll just pick on one, right, which is, hey, the work from home allowance, right? Oh yeah, we're going to hybrid. We'll have office expenditure. So why do we need to sustain work from home? Well, one of the thesis of hybrid is your people will still be working from home for half the time. So the home office allowances shouldn't be considered as a one and done. And that's where people are recognizing that you have to make sure that you're adapting your policies for the future. So as you think about trying to create best in class, don't shift left, shift right on this thesis.
And Jimit, another interesting aspect is that in our research, it shows that because of COVID, a lot of investments in health and wellness became priority, but the investments in learning and development, or the approach towards investing in work from home, is probably taking a hit more often than not. So those are also the bottom 2 are the areas where companies are not investing as much as they need to right now.
Yep. The second dimension, Rohit, you had was on culture, right? And again, we've spoken about this before, and I think it bore out in the correlations that culture is probably the most important dimension, which is important to think about, right? And love the Vestrum thesis that was used by the Google DevOps Research Association, DORA, right? But they speak about creating a generative culture versus a bureaucratic culture, right? And I think this is where, if we look at the aspects that truly become important, it's around thesis of agility. No surprise there. People need to recognize that they're creating the right impact in a collaborative environment where they're entrusted with accountability, and there's time and permission for innovation, right? And obviously, as you think about it, elements which people are also trying to embed within their cultural pillars is to make sure that there's diversity and inclusion, and a thesis of how you operate in a lean manner, because as organizations, we are getting we're getting used to working in an environment of scarcity. So if you think about cultural pillars, these are the 5 areas that came across as the most important ones. And as we look ahead, it's not just about the culture that you generate, but workers also have expectations from their leaders. And some of the things we were looking to understand is what are really the desired attributes that employees have from their senior management, from their leaders. And it kind of came down to 4 themes, right? Which was their ability to inspire, their ability to innovate, their ability to execute, and their ability to connect, right? Now, each of these themes also had additional sub-dimensions. The one that I think is becoming really important in this current environment is the last one, which is to what extent are people able to relate with their leaders and their ability to communicate, how well they learn, and how well they empathize, right? And I think it's not just enough to be able to say, let's change policy, let's train employees, and we are done. But a lot of this is also about how we create the right framework to help our leaders develop.
This is really interesting, Jimit. And looking at all of that, I want to talk about work environment. And predominantly how all the different aspects of work environment come together to make employees productive. When the pandemic started and everybody moved remotely, there was a period during which we heard this comment the most. Employee productivity has increased. It has increased dramatically. Shortly afterwards, people realized that it was a throughput increase. People saved time from commuting, time from distractions, and they were under lockdown, most of them working from home. So they were working more, they were delivering more. But as it continued, we saw how productivity related views diversified, all sorts of mixed opinions, and also reduction in the conviction around increase in productivity. But there are many levers to drive IT productivity, and all of them put together are about your work environment. How do you get people to be more productive in a sustainable manner? You need to think about org culture. How do you break or create silos? How do you create more coherence between the teams? How do you think about different ways of business models? There is a lot of focus on reskilling people, but what about hiring people for learnability? What about helping people become better at learning and unlearning and relearning? The role that technology plays to do that, and then all the other factors, right? How do you think about a hybrid working model? Which teams need to be co-located? Which teams need to spend time together? What is the purpose of being in the same place at the same time? All of that needs to come together to think about how productivity can improve. We have done some very thought-provoking work with some of the enterprises recently. And what is interesting is that there is no one size fit all approach. Even within an organization, we have seen different teams or different functions, depending on the nature of work they do, have adopted slightly different approaches to unlock true productivity. And as you think about creating productive teams in a hybrid environment, what is also important is to think about the different models in which companies operate in a hybrid work. So on the next page, we have some of these examples. We often get this question, especially in the last few months as companies have started to come back. What percentage of my workforce should work should work from office? What percentage from home? There is no single answer, because you may define, and then we have some of these delivery models in front of you here. You may define some teams that will work from office, others that can work fully remote, but both of them are minority, share of your overall workforce. The truth is that majority of the workforce will work in a hybrid model. Now, what that hybrid model may look like, it will vary. We have few different models, and we see split week model kind of being office 1 day a week, 2 days a week, becoming most prominent. But the common fallacies is something I want to emphasize on. Organizations making the mistake of thinking they can appoint a model to a team and that's it. No, flexibility is the key. You need to think about, is this model fit for that team in a continuous situation, or does it change based on the maturity of the team, new projects you are taking up, new team that you are bringing in? What if a mature team goes through very high attrition and a lot of people are new? Do they need to be together more often before they are comfortable working more remotely? All of those things you need to think about. To enable it, you need to think about cost-related considerations, employee preferences, and again, like I said, flexibility is the key. So you need to be flexible. You can't be rushing your teams or employees into adapting to a particular model. You have to wait and watch and then kind of scale it up gradually. That's very important right now.
Yeah. And Rohit, I think what all of this is telling us is that gone are the days where you could take a broad brushstroke approach to policy design and expect that you're not going to really have exceptions. I think people are recognizing they're having to create different personas of employees and then create different policies potentially, and then give people flexibility to swap between these personas, which is obviously not the way things were designed before.
Not at all. And these personas are interesting because whatever personas you end up defining, recognize that employees will not stay in a particular persona forever. So even there needs to be reassessment, flexibility, because employees in different life stages will, kind of relate themselves to different personas. And talking about policies, and also to wrap up some of the insights we have today, policies around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are also very important. We have seen the traditional approach, like Jimit said, if you're on the left, welcome to 2020, because everybody has talked about racial diversity, gender diversity, being an equal opportunity employer, and very prominently diversity at the leadership level. But are you helping differently abled or the broader set of a broader diverse set of workforce come in? Are you helping them belong? So creating that sense of belonging. Are your policies gender neutral? Very simple things around paternity policies, some of the other insurance benefits. Are they gender neutral? Are you inspired by the phenomena to create equity? Do you stand for social accountability? We are increasingly hearing top organizations globally say that some of the best of the candidates are actually declining offers because they don't think these organizations are socially accountable. So some of that is becoming very real right now.
Yep. And Rohit, I think there's also this whole theme around authenticity, right? And I think very quickly people are recognizing how much of this is where you're just trying to participate because it's the right noises to make, versus you truly embody these values, and people start to think of these as value systems. So I do believe that this is one of the least appreciated components of what's really going to drive EVP in the future. And we think that some of the best in class companies are truly driving different behaviors and fulfilling on their promise around these next generation themes you've called out.
Yep. Once again, we'll recap that we have a special offer for all our listeners today. So if you want to compare your organization's brand perception to your peers, use the link in the description in the chat. You can pick the location where you want to do this comparison, and you can list up to 4 peers, and we'll get back to you with a very customized assessment for you. This is completely free of charge. So feel free to take up that offer.
All right, so I know we've got a few questions to take up. So before we get there, just a quick wrap up, right? Rohit, I know you said this before, but here's the 5 considerations. Think total rewards, not just comp and ben. Embrace flexibility. One size fits all rule books are very 2020. Let's stick to that theme. We don't like the year 2020, if you couldn't tell. Facilitate an environment of continuous learning. Create an EVP that truly amplifies culture, purpose, and some of the more softer aspects of work. And then create a pervasive diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. We really see that as being one of the big differentiators in the marketplace. Okay, so with that, we have Q&A coming through. And Rohit, do you have the questions that are coming in? Actually, I see a couple, and maybe I can pose one to you. What is the timeline you see for relief in the tech talent shortage or decrease in demand, especially given some of this noise around recession? Rohit?
Hey, sorry, Jimit, I was on mute, right? I was just blabbering about having that crystal ball. I would be a very wealthy person. But taking a shot at this, we have done assessment to look at the supply side and the demand side trends. And at least for the next 3 years, for the core IT skills or the in-demand IT skills, which people also call next generation IT skills, we don't see the gap reducing. So what we're asking organizations is that looking out and trying to buy ready talent, project ready talent, is not looking like a feasible option in the next 3 years. So be prepared to build this talent internally and then augment it with what you find in the market. So it needs to be uh, a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, I know there's some chatter out there again about, hey, how the recession's causing tech to stop hiring, etc. But if you just look at the delta right now, yes, the gap might diminish, but there's still a mismatch between demand and supply, which means that the environment we are in is expected to stay, right?
Yep. Jimit, let me ask you a question, which is very interesting, is that going back to that banking and financial services industry ratings or rankings, TD Bank, which was at number 5, there's a question that they had a C rating in employee satisfaction, still on top 5. The listener understands that this is weighted average, but how can a company rated C be among top 5?
And I think it's a great question. We examined that like 6 ways to Sunday just because we were dealing with that same issue. And fundamentally, it comes down to the individual dimensions. If you look at the TD Bank scores on things like diversity, they were in the top 2, right? On things around work environment, career progression, they were consistently in the top 5. And if you go back to a comment I'd made earlier, this is forced separation. So a C is harsh, we get it, but a C is in some ways middle of the pack, right? So, and based on our own math, it's something like more than 70% of employees would be comfortable referring you to their friends, right? So it's not as if it's a 50% score or a 40% score that's giving you a C. It's still a respectable 70%. And we are being harsh in terms of those grades. So fundamentally, as you look at that, you're in the top 2 in 1 or 2 dimensions. You're consistently in the top 5 in the others. So even if you are outside the top 5 from a ESAT score on a weighted average basis, which is effectively what this is, TD Bank score still came up in the top 5. Let's you and I keep bouncing these questions. So hey, there's one on when you say more about personas, right, as opposed to broad strokes. Can you clarify a bit more in terms of what we are seeing for personas in the talent industry?
Yep, this is very interesting. So different organizations are adopting this slightly differently. But I'll take one example is that one of the leading banks, they have 4 or 5 personas. So they have, for example, young parents or very young workers, who are kind of in their first jobs. They have a persona where people need to take care of their elderly or somebody, and so on, right? So people in different life stages with a very different set of priorities or obligations. And then they're thinking or they're analyzing, collecting feedback from their employees is, what are your preferences? So for example, earlier we had that slide where we said all your teams can fit into the following hybrid delivery models. Even if a team is expected to work in a split week model, but somebody fits into a different employee persona where they are a young parent with certain restrictions and they can't be in office, how do you provide them that flexibility? By way of support from team members, technology, to be able to commute less, to be able to travel a little bit more or less frequently, compensate for them. This is about providing flexibility. And let me say this, the talent market situation, the demand supply gap is making organizations more sensitive to this, because can you afford to lose relevant high quality talent because you are not willing to accommodate some flexibility? That's the question that they are being asked, and hence creating these personas and then reevaluating them and providing appropriate flexibility is what we see organizations working on.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun days, right? And if I draw parallel with the other industry we understand, which is the CX versus the EX, right? Customer experience versus employee experience. A few years ago, we were talking about personas in customer experience, which moved to personalization. Part of me shudders to think if that's the direction we need to head through for employee experience. I don't think we can truly get to personalization there, but there's precedent.
We have a couple of minutes, Sumit. Let me ask you one more question.
Keep it easy.
What is the average tenure that you think a Gen Z employees can be retained in an organization?
3.6 years. No, I'm making that up. No, that's, I wish we had a good answer to that. We don't. It's part of the body of work that we need to do around this. I know there have been some other questions as well. Hey, to what extent is this broken down by cohort? We are on this journey to understand how we look at talent, and getting into double clicks by demographic cohort is part of the roadmap that we want to be on. But at this point, I don't think we have a good answer as to what's the average tenure. I think I keep forgetting at what age we started getting in, but I recall that it was probably late 2019 that we started to talk about how Gen Z is in the workforce, right? So if you think about that, we are fundamentally just 3 or 4 years into that cohort being in here. So I still think it might be a bit early to call out some of the trends around that.
Judith, one point I want to add is that while everybody talks about how the next generation likes flexibility, is very tech savvy, can work remotely, we are also hearing very concerning stats around early tenure attrition. So employees who could never set a foot in the office, never meet their colleagues, they are feeling isolated. They are looking for a better work environment. And to achieve that, they change their jobs, which leads to attrition. So yes, I think the Gen Z aspect needs to be looked into more closely, because there was a very unique situation that impacted probably what would have been their natural entry into the workforce in the last few years. So, Judith, we have a couple of minutes. Anything you want to call out before we wrap up?
No, I'd say hopefully you can tell this is very exciting for us. We've been committed to advancing the body of work on talent research and making sure that we are able to bring our insights across. So really appreciate the dialogue, appreciate the questions, appreciate the feedback. And all I'll say is watch this space for more. The individual rankings, as we said, they're available for anyone to download. So, if someone needs to find them, let us know. But we look forward to bringing our insights on how to really create excellent talent practices for your organizations. So thank you, everyone.